So good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to see you in real life, but we're not alone. We have another crowd of 200 people joining us online, so also a warm welcome to those people, even though they won't be able to benefit from the good coffee, the snacks, and the lunch later on. We're still in code red here in Belgium, which means we have to respect a number of restrictions. Tomorrow will be code orange, but that won't help us today. But I'll be coming back to that later on in terms of practical arrangements. So this is the final conference of the MORE project. I'm Karen van Kluijzen. I'm the Secretary General of POLIS, a European network of cities and regions working together on sustainable urban mobility and innovation, and we were one of the partners in the project. And it's our pleasure to welcome you here in our hometown in Brussels. So what is the MORE project all about? The title says it. It's Better Streets for Better Cities, and this is really important. So the website is roadspace.eu, and that's what we will be talking about. This is what we want less of in our cities, and what we want more of is images like this, and this. But how do we get there? The thing is, road space is an extremely scarce and therefore very valuable resource for cities. The good news, however, is that cities are in charge of that road space as well. So by reallocating space, by respacing city streets, they can also really decide which modes they want to prioritize. And that's exactly also what the MORE project has been looking into. How can we build in certain processes and tools to better address the needs of urban street space, but also the conflicting needs of urban street space. It's not always easy to reconcile all the different functions that have been allocated or are being allocated to our streets, not to mention the conflicts between the different modes, all asking for their share of that road space. Instrumental and also important in the MORE project is stakeholder involvement in that respect. We've also been exploring how we can more flexibly and more dynamically make use of that space and maybe allocate different functions throughout the day. And finally, we've been looking into the role of urban nodes in the trans-European transport network and the different responsibilities that this brings along. So in this morning session, we will be telling you more about the MORE project, so I won't be going into further detail. And just a quick overview of what the project partnership looks like. We had 5 European cities that have been involved as case studies and looking at their role in the trans-European transport network and the different roles of their streets in that respect. And then you see we had a number of research partners and also a wide representation of user groups through a number of European networks, as well as some consultants that also joined the project. So a very rich and complementary partnership that has generated very interesting insights and results as well. Now, without any further ado, let me also tell you a bit more about what we will be listening to in this morning session. We will start with an opening session from Matthew Baldwin. I'll be coming back to that in a second. And we are very, very happy to have a keynote speech from Pascal Smet, who is the Secretary of State of the Brussels Capital Region and is in charge of urbanism. And he perfectly fits the scope of today's conference. Then we'll be moving on to presentations, as I mentioned, that really dive more deeply into what the MORE project has been doing in its different dimensions. And then in the afternoon, we'll continue also with what the cities have been doing. So if you, the people online, would like to ask questions, you're very welcome to do so by making use of Slido and using the code that you see on the slide right now. So, and then my colleagues will make sure that your questions make it to me as well and to the speakers. If we have time, we're on a tight schedule, so we'll have to make sure as well that all the speakers stick to the allocated time slots. Coming back to the housekeeping and safety measures, please keep on your face masks at all times, not when you're eating or drinking, obviously. But we will have to sit down during the lunch break. This is a rule that is changing tomorrow, but today, unfortunately, we still have to stick to that requirement. Okay, let me now, without any further ado, welcome the first speaker of the morning session, and that is Matthew Baldwin, a dear friend of sustainable urban mobility. He's Deputy Director General at DG Move, but also European Coordinator for Road Safety and Sustainable Mobility and Mission Manager of Climate Neutral and Smart Cities Mission. So a very long title with many roles, Matthew, but all very relevant for the topics that are on today's agenda. Matthew will be touching upon in his welcome speech on the European Green Deal, the recently launched Urban Mobility Framework, and obviously the mission that he is currently managing. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much indeed, Karen. It's wonderful to be with you today to talk about more, which in marketing terms is a pretty good title for any project. I don't think there's been a Horizon Europe project entitled Less, and I would not be in favor if it was. As you said, Karen, I want to talk a bit about the broader context in a moment. What I really like about this project is the focus on space, how we use it in cities, how this limited, how this scarce space allocated to mobility is quintessentially shared and needs to be prioritized. We in the Commission have been working a lot and talking a lot about external costs, how we need to quote-unquote, internalize the external costs of our mobility in our horrific jargon. The air and noise pollution, the congestion, the terrible costs of road crashes, which is very telling in terms of numbers, 800 billion to 1 trillion of euros annually of external costs. But if we look at this whole equation differently in terms of space, how it's shared, as the wonderful Philippe Christ at OECD has been urging us to do for some time, is an excellent complement to the cost and benefit analysis from a city perspective. Space on our roads is public space. Space that can and frankly should be adapted to accommodate its safe use by all road users. That space is not inherently free in either sense of the word, for the driving of cars or for the parking of cars. And if you ask any city official, maybe we should ask Pascal, what the hardest issue they face, they'll often say it is access restrictions in favor of buses or pedestrians or cyclists, closely followed by parking or parking fees. And it's the sense that too many people still have, in my opinion, that there is an inherent right to drive or park your car on public space, and that's still out there, bubbling away, and that lies behind these difficulties. And it's not a coincidence that cities across Europe have found it very hard, for example, to raise the level of annual parking fees to anything close to the real costs of that of action. So this MORE project is also great because it brings, if you like, the mobility experts and the planning guys into the same room, into the same analysis, if you like, which I gather has not always been the case. And last but not least, you're catching the COVID, or indeed post-COVID wave, hopefully, where everyone, and not just the transport nerds amongst us, have become so much more conscious about the role of space in our cities, from just how big cars have got, to the reallocation of parking spaces to enable people to line up outside shops, or to enable them to eat more safely outside in Brussels' famously good weather, which, as we know, is perfect for al fresco dining. To the broader European context, which is what you asked me to talk about, Karen. A very rapid tour, I promise. I am sort of confident that this room will have heard just a little bit about the European Green Deal as part of this minor existential battle we face against climate change in which we're all engaged. The need to be climate neutral as a continent. I'm obsessed with cities. As a continent by 2050, as part of that to cut our greenhouse gas emissions from transport by 90%, our emissions overall by 55% by 2030. The Commission's Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy of 2020 sets out the big themes behind that, namely how all modes have to be sustainable. But in the short term, we have to ensure that sustainable alternatives to highly polluting modes exist and that they're properly incentivized. This covers the whole waterfront of transport, of course, the need to put a greater priority on rail transport, ensuring that we've got a strong infrastructure for alternative fuels for road vehicles, prioritizing investment in green modes. But at the same time, and this is every bit as important in our towns and cities as elsewhere in the transport system, the Commission stresses how important mobility is for our economy, for our single market, for our daily life and our well-being. So if you flip those arguments around, the success of the European Green Deal, in mobility terms, in transport, depends on our ability to make the system as a whole sustainable, in the largest sense of that word. Now, as many of you will also know, the EU has been reticent, probably rightly so, about delving too much into what are the responsibilities of national, regional, and local authorities. Subsidiarity still reigns. We are not going to tell cities, Pascal, what to do, I promise. That said, I think there is much more recognition of what the EU role can or should be, given the cross-border implications of much of this, the network effects of the first and last mile of transport and of course, passenger and freight. The broader understanding of how cities play a vital role in our overall mobility. And last but not least, the role that the EU can play in stimulating things like multimodal transformation through EU rules, for example, on multimodal travel information services. So to back all that up, in December came our green and efficient mobility package. Do we know how to market or what? Green and efficient, who could be against that? Including some very strong new ideas for the 10T network, the trans-European networks, and in particular to develop the concept of urban nodes in a powerful way, linking them to sustainable urban mobility plans, linking them to sustainable urban mobility indicators, data, data, data. And I'm sure many of you will have had a good look at the new urban mobility framework as part of that, the OOMF, as I insist on calling it, which talks for the first time about the need in our member states, in our regions, in our cities to prioritize the needs of active mobility, such as walking and cycling, such as public transport, such as shared mobility, to reduce this dependence on private cars. And again, back to external costs, this can be for road safety, this can be for congestion, it can be for general public health concerns, it can be because we're worried about pollution or climate change. But as a result, it translates into specific needs. We want more public transport, but we want cleaner public transport. Our public consultation, by the way, showed a very strong overall support on the need for safer, more accessible walking and cycling infrastructures, safe and separated from car traffic, protecting these vulnerable but valuable road users, and of course supporting the short distance city concept. And on that, our staff working document, which you haven't seen, it's a big block of paper, but it's a rich mine of detail, also pinpoints the importance of spatial transformation in cities, all the way from allocating space to sustainable modes, to the 15-minute, or now I hear the 10-minute city, the idea of superblocks, low traffic neighborhoods, the city pizza slice concept. It always seems to come down to food in the end in cities, but that's okay. So that's the broader mobility context, the backdrop, which I think shows how important projects like MORE are to what we're trying to achieve at the EU level. I have a distinct feeling that Pascal Smet is going to tell us that things like MORE are also central to what Brussels is trying to achieve. And I could not pass without saying that those of us who live here really appreciate, Pascal, what you and Elke and the colleagues are doing and have done to make Brussels a more livable and lovable city. Which brings me to my final point, or back to the first point, if you like. Cities are fundamentally in the front line of action against climate change. We need cities to deliver across the board, not just in mobility, on energy, distribution, efficiency, on buildings renovation, on waste management, if we are going to win this battle. Which is why I'm very proud to be managing this new mission to have 100 climate neutral cities in place by 2030. We've just closed our call for expression of interest, and we've been almost literally blown away by more than 350 expressions of interest for cities from every one of our member states, including the region of Brussels. And we now have the Herculean challenge of choosing a diverse group of cities to tackle this enormous but vital task. And I have to be pretty careful in what I say now about Brussels, but I was, of course, very pleased as a resident to see that the region of Brussels has come forward. Watch this space. We will announce the cities in April. Final point. All of this, I think, links up. First, the most basic street planning and design transformation, whether it's to tackle climate change, reduce air and noise pollution, reduce road deaths, or indeed simply to more fairly allocate space on our publicly owned infrastructure, it all takes us in the same direction, exactly as Karen was saying. It doesn't matter so much what your specific focus is, in terms of delivering these co-benefits, as I like to call them, or we're reducing our external costs, maximizing the best use of public space, it goes in the same direction. Second, the process by which you build stakeholder engagement in projects like MORE and turning that engagement into decisions that stick, sustainable decisions, is for me the key to unlocking the door, not just to climate neutral cities, but happy and healthy and functioning cities, based on the recognition and the reconciliation of all user needs and expectations. And thirdly, and really finally, Karen, please don't forget the implications of your work for the global negotiations on things like climate change. These negotiations are pretty weird to me. They're being done around a global problem. They're being tackled between member states in our Westphalian system, but it's being implemented, it's going to have to be implemented in cities. And that's why in Glasgow it was so important that sustainable urban mobility activists from all parts of your coalition, including you, Karen, so successfully fought to ensure that the Glasgow Declaration at COP26 was not just about the promotion of electric vehicles, which are of course a necessary but far from sufficient tool in delivering sustainable mobility, and of course, particularly in that context, in cities. Please continue this work. There is another COP this year, and maybe we could go a little bit further. In the meantime, what Moore has put on the table in terms of its key recommendations for policy and process is, in my view, an essential building block to the work we face in the Commission and beyond. So I'd like to just close by saying thank you very much for this great work, and I look forward to hearing more of the details this morning. Thank you very much.